Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master. And before we get into today's episode, smash that like button, make sure you're still subscribed, and leave us a comment. That helps us out with the YouTube algorithm, but also we love hearing from you guys. We've got an awesome community here, and that's thanks to you. So thank you so much for being here. So, having said all of that, let's get into it. So, as of me recording this, it's actually for me late April, and we were supposed to play a game this past Sunday, but we didn't because my son woke up that morning with a lot of pain in his abdomen. He told me about it. I ended up taking him to the emergency room, and it turned out to be his appendix. So, of course, we canceled the game. My son got his appendix removed. And by the way, before anybody asks, he seems fine now. He's just sore from surgery, of course. But that said, we didn't play a game this week. And the way it normally works is we play the game on Sunday, and then usually on either, Sunday night or Monday or something like that, I record a video while everything is still fresh in my mind, right? So that meant that now I didn't have a video for this week, right? And it was going to have an effect on our upload schedule. But then I got to kind of thinking about it and how on Sunday we were supposed to play our first game with the Violet Lantern Corps, also known as the Star Sapphires, right? And I realized that there were actually a lot of things that I wanted to say, not only to kind of set all that up, but also to kind of like justify some of the decisions I made as a game master and some of the conclusions that I arrived at, right? I figured that if I didn't, then there would probably be a bunch of comments, from various people who were kind of wondering what I was thinking. And I get it, right? So, since we were missing a game anyways, I thought maybe this would be a good time to talk about who is my favorite Marvel character of all time, Rogue of X-Men fame. On Earth K, the first time we ever saw Rogue, she was tending bar in the Deep South in 1979. That's when she first met a variant of Arthur named Omnius, who had just become an immortal after a trip to the world of Dungeons and Dragons. Those two conceived a son named Matrix, who went on to become a teenage hero in our world in the 90s when X-Men was at the height of its popularity. And the Rogue of Earth K wound up happily married with a bunch of kids. And one reason that we had her and Omnius get married was because immortals are immune to anything that isn't an attack from a fellow immortal, right? So that meant that her killer powers didn't work on Omnius at all. And while her kids were half immortal, her grandkids were only a quarter, which meant that she still had some issues with her powers potentially hurting those that she loved, right? And so eventually, we decided to give her a power ring from DC Comics because each power ring creates a skin tight, invisible force field around the wearer. And by doing that, it would allow Rogue to touch people. And when it came to power rings, the first one we thought of giving her was, of course, a Green Lantern ring, right? Because after all, Rogue certainly has worn plenty of green over the years. And for like a hot second, that seemed like the way to go. But then we thought about it. And if we're being really honest, as much as I adore the character, she doesn't exactly scream Green Lantern material. In fact, the poor girl has buckled more times than I can count, right? She's given in, she's made bad decisions, all in these various moments of weakness, which is arguably the exact opposite of what a Green Lantern should be all about, right? So we started looking at the other colors. And so red is for rage and anger. And while she is certainly frustrated with things, we felt like other characters were better suited to be Red Lanterns, like the Red Hulk or Wolverine or whoever, right? But not really so much Rogue. Likewise, orange is the color of greed. And while everyone can want things from time to time or be kind of covetous or whatever, we figured that something else would be a better fit. Yellow, according to DC, is fear. In my own personal headcanon, I kind of reinterpret that as intimidation, right? Not so much that you feel fear, but that you put fear into others. So, of course, characters for me that come to mind there are like Batman and Scarecrow. But again, not really Rogue so much. And it's not that she's never intimidated anybody ever, more like I felt like it just wasn't the best fit, right? Blue is hope. And again, I love Rogue, but if we're being really honest, she can feel pretty hopeless at times, right? Where she just is in deep despair and so on and so forth. And I just thought that wasn't really the way to go. And then there's Indigo, which is compassion. And actually, this didn't seem that bad at first. I could see Rogue being very compassionate, actually, especially an older Rogue who has kind of settled down some and has kids and grandkids and stuff like that. You know, she's mellowed out quite a bit over the years in our game world, at least. But then we looked at it deeper. And apparently, DC has said that in order to be an Indigo Lantern, you have to be without compassion. And then it's the Indigo tribe that gives you the ring to more or less teach you a lesson, right? Sort of like there was an old movie called The Shadow that I loved, where the title character, Lamont Cranston, was a tyrant in Asia sometime between World War I and World War II. And a wise man forced him to repent and make amends as the titular character, right? Anyways, so this, by the way, this struck me as odd because Ray Palmer, also known as the Atom, right, had been an Indigo Lantern for a while, right? But then again, DC Comics famously loves to reboot every few years. So for all I know, maybe the Atom is some grim dark serial killer for now, right? I don't know. I quit reading comics a long time ago. And speaking, by the way, of inconsistencies when it comes to what it takes to be a member of a corps, that brings us to the Violet Lantern Corps, right? Also known as the Star Sapphires. First of all, DC can't even really decide if they want to color them in as like purple or magenta or pink. So even the name Violet Lantern Corps is kind of wonky. And then when you get to what fuels them, we're told that it's love, right? But then some of the examples we're actually given are characters who were wronged and became jaded. And to me, honestly, when I see different writers talking about it, it seems like they should be talking about red lanterns at that point, right? None of that sounds like how I would define love. Some folks say that love is patient and kind and is not easily angered, keeps no record of wrongs. It always protects and perseveres, which brings us to Wonder Woman, who was a Violet Lantern. And according to Ethan Van Sciver, who, to the best of my knowledge, was the DC employee who came up with the emotional spectrum and how it supposedly worked, EVS said that Wonder Woman was a Violet Lantern because she loved all mankind. which is what the Greeks would refer to as agape love. It's unconditional and self sacrificing. It's a kind of love that is given freely without expecting any sort of a reward. The Greeks also had a concept called eros love, which was the romantic or passionate love that we so often now in modern society think of as love, or often we conflate it with lust, right? And then there is philia love, which is friendship or brotherly love. And for this one, I personally think of soldiers who have each other's backs, right? So obviously, I'm not talking about something romantic, right? But I would hope that all of us know some soldiers who have formed deep bonds in years after they are no longer serving together. They keep in touch and so on and so forth, right? That to me, that's philia love. And then there's storge love, which would kind of be like the love that a mother or a father has for their child. And if I remember correctly, by the way, there was an alien woman named Miriam, I want to say, whose love for her children was actually what caused her to be recruited by the Violet Lantern Corps, right? Um, so while all of this is sort of nebulous, right, the way DC defines it and different writers are saying different things about it, um, it's more than a little open to interpretation, right? But it seems to me that what fuels a violet ring could be agape love or eros love or philia love or storge love. And so then we look at rogue, right? And why this color, in my humble opinion, is actually the one that suits her the best. Because for sure, her inability to kiss or hug another person was something that Rogue was very vocal about for decades in the comics, right? So clearly, romance was important to her. And then when it comes to brotherly love, there's the affection she has for her fellow X-Men, and she often refers to them as her family. And Rogue would not only die for them, we've also seen her be willing to do that for innocent civilians if she had to. So she's got the agape base covered too, right? And then last but not least, there's the family love between mother and child. And I've read comics where because Mystique raised Rogue, despite everything that Mystique has done wrong, Rogue still allows her to escape, or she keeps Wolverine from killing Mystique. And then we've seen Rogue have kids of her own in various what ifs, or like in the Age of Apocalypse. And so she's demonstrated philia love too, right? And I mention all of this to explain our thinking when it came to giving Rogue a violet power ring. Um, but I also mention it because it shows our thinking on what actually fuels the ring and why other characters seem like they would make good additions to the Violet Lantern Corps as well. It's also worth noting that EVS said that he looked at the emotional spectrum as Roy G. Biv in that order, right? Roy G. Biv, for younger listeners who may have never heard that before, stands for red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, right? So green is in the very middle of that. And according to EVS, green was the only color where the user is actually 100% in control of the ring. But when it came to those colors next to green on like a color wheel, right, which those next two colors are yellow and blue, in their case, the ring's user is mostly in control, but now the yellow ring or the blue ring is actually exerting some influence over the wearer. And then when it comes to the next two colors out, which are orange and indigo, EVS said that in those cases, the rings are mostly in control, but the user still has some control. And I guess this is why the newer comics are giving indigo rings to tyrants and forcing them to be sort of like less of a jerk. Likewise, when somebody covets the orange ring, once they put it on, then it's very hard to take off. With the orange ring stuff, they were really ripping off a lot of stuff from the Lord of the Rings movies, right? With that ring. Anyway, so when you get to the ends of the spectrum with red and violet, supposedly those rings have all the influence over the user. So in the case of a red power ring, it brings out the rage and the hate and all of that negative stuff, right? And at that point, I'm actually thinking that red rings probably aren't really all that discerning. Everyone has something that's made them angry, right? And whatever that is, the red ring is going to use whatever it can. That makes me think, too, that to some extent, if you gave a violet ring to somebody, the equal opposite should probably be true. Everybody loves something or someone, and the violet rings are just going to use whatever they can, right? But in their case, they would cause the ring's wearers to actually be more loving, right? If the red rings make people bigger jerks, which we've seen, by the way, we've seen it happen to guys like Guy Gardner and stuff like that, which I know it's hard to believe he can be an even bigger jerk than he already is, but I've seen it. But at any rate, I feel like the violet rings then have the potential to do the polar opposite, right? And so, from that point of view, almost anybody could be a member of the Violet Lantern Corps, especially if you start to think of agape, eros, philia, and storge as new attributes. And I mean that in the game mechanics sense, right? And that any of these four new attributes then are, you could use the APs of that attribute, and then you would say that's how many APs of, omnipower or whatever the wearer has. And that's what we did, by the way. Since DC Heroes was made in the 1980s, long before the emotional spectrum was even a thing, we figured we kind of had to create these four new attributes as a sort of a house rule just for the Violet Lantern characters. And before anyone says it, yes, I'm sure we are probably contradicting things that DC Comics has said recently. But honestly, I feel like the more you read what DC has said about Violet Lanterns over the years and what makes them work, the more contradictions you're probably going to discover. So, between that and the fact that our game takes place in an alternate dimension, anyways, right? I figured that kind of gave me the freedom to do as I please. So, all that said, Rogue, kind of getting back on topic here, is married to Omnius the Immortal. And as we recently stated on the podcast, he was granting immortality to his various family members, including Rogue, which means that her old physical body is no more. Once she undergoes her ascension, she's able to create a new physical body. And as one would expect, she chooses one without the old one's problems, right? She obviously hated that she couldn't touch people, so she's not going to do that again. And we had this big discussion about whether or not she could actually be a mutant. And our gamers were more or less split about 50-50 on that concept. According to TSR's old Wrath of the Immortals box set, an immortal can turn into any race they've ever met with the abilities of that specific race, which to many of us implied a sense of uniformity. So, like, for instance, you could turn into a Kryptonian because all Kryptonians basically have the same powers, right? The same would go for like the Skrull or the Kree or Green Martians or whatever, right? But mutants don't have all the same powers. I actually remember an episode of the X-Men animated series in the 90s where Jubilee asks Beast why mutants mutate. And Beast starts listing off everything from gamma radiation to pollution, which I always thought was interesting because to me, that really sounds less like how a lot of us think of a Marvel style mutant and more like what Marvel calls a mutate. The Incredible Hulk being a great example of that, right? And surely, by the way, that's why Beast name dropped gamma radiation because Banner assumedly never would have had powers if not for the gamma bomb, right? That made him into the Hulk. So an immortal could not turn into a Hulk because Hulk is a mutate. So his base race, we could think of that as him being a human, right? So the immortal couldn't turn into a Hulk. They could only turn into the base race, which is the human. Same goes for Spider-Man, whose powers obviously came from a radioactive spider bite. Will, by the way, ignore the Spider-Girl comics that actually suggested that had Spider-Man not been bitten by the spider, he would have eventually become an X-Men style mutant and that his wall crawling was actually a form of telekinesis. But anyway, so the point is that mutants don't all have the same powers, and they may technically, in the very specific way TSR words it, be considered human. In the same sense that Spider-Man and the Hulk would be considered humans who have mutated, right? But that humanity is the base race. And therefore, mutants in the X-Men sense would not be forms that an immortal could take. Again, our group of players was split about 50-50 on how that would work. But so that meant that once Rogue became an immortal, she could not go back to being a mutant, assuming that this theory is correct. And even if mutants are a race, in the specific sense that TSR was alluding to, would she even have the same powers? Or would she create a new body and she would have to roll completely random mutant powers, right? So we decided to pick a different race that would come close to letting her do what she used to do, but without the touch thing that she didn't want, right? So my wife, who plays Rogue, had her become a Kryptonian. That way she is still strong, she can fly, etc. And the omni power of the violet power ring can be substituted for any other powers in the book, right? Including any that Rogue might actually want to use that's something she's had in the past. And Rogue, by the way, was not the only character in this situation. So the premise for the next game, which is slated to be played this Sunday, is that everybody is picking a character that they think has something to do with love, and Rogue is going to give them a power ring, thus recruiting a bunch of new people into the Violet Lantern Corps. I'd talk more about the various characters that the players have picked, but I think that would probably be better if I saved it for the next video and we just let this one be kind of a spotlight on Rogue, you know? We on our end are looking forward to playing the Star Sapphire games. I hope you guys are looking forward to that too. And hopefully you also enjoyed this video. If so, it would mean a lot to us if you took a quick second of your time to help our humble little channel grow. And you can do that by hitting like, making sure that you're still subscribed because YouTube loves to unsubscribe you and not tell you. And last but not least, leave us a comment. If you had to pick a character that has something to do with one of the types of love that I went over in this video, what character would you choose? I'd be curious to see who you'd pick. And maybe we'll try to work those characters into future adventures. In the meantime, I hope you guys have a great week, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye.